This time bringing you my first impressions for Avernum, Escape from the Pit, which is a remake of an old demoware game from Spiderweb Software, of course, which has quite a few CRPGs I've yet to get around to taking a look at, which is obviously what we're doing here. And of all of their games, I would say the 6 Avernum titles are probably the most well-known, but pretty much everything that studio has done has in fact been cult classics all around. But I've been pretty slow about getting through all of their CRPGs because, quite frankly, they're constantly remaking them. In fact, they are actually in the middle of remaking Avernum 4, which is coming out sometime later this year, or at least that's the plan anyway. And so it's important that I go through the original trilogy first before we get to that, and obviously we gotta start from the beginning, which is Escape from the Pit here. I mentioned that this is a sort of remake of a remake. Well, the original Avernum, or as it was actually known, Exile 1, Escape from the Pit, was released all the way back in 1995. And it was demoware or shareware, basically sort of just extensive demo software that allowed you to play for quite some time before having to actually buy it. But then in 2000, that game was remade as Avernum, and then in 2011, Avernum was remade as Avernum Escape from the Pit, which released on PC in 2012. So it's available on Steam, you can grab it there, which is how I'm taking a look at it. But with that out of the way, let's obviously dive into some of the actual details here. First and foremost, as always, somewhat pleasantly surprised when I jump into Spiderweb Software's titles, because yes, sure, there's some visual and UI stuff you always have to get used to, but if you're willing to get past that, there tends to be a really good story at the core of it. And what surprised me in this instance was actually how sort of free-form this seems to be. Basically, the plot of Avernum is that you are branded a criminal and thrown into what they call the Pit, or Avernum, a sort of underworld filled with monsters, despair, caverns, and quite possibly just straight-up starvation for all they know. The prevailing thought is that people that get sent down here are just being sent to die, which is what you might think is the case, but upon arriving, it actually seems that there's quite a few settlements pretty well set up down here. And you can go in between them doing all sorts of quests and getting up to date and on your feet in terms of gear and equipment. And here and there, as you do that, you start to notice some conspiracies and that kind of thing. So I'm going to be watching exactly how this plays out, because right away it seems to be a much bigger game than I thought, as the sort of world map consists of a very, very large sort of cavernous area that sees you moving by like boats and stuff, which is kind of neat. My understanding is you can fly at one point, which will certainly be interesting. But before we do any of that, you might want to know how the game is running, and so far so good. Games back in 2012 aren't that old. And while this game does seem to struggle with 4K monitors a little bit, there's a couple settings you can tweak to get it to properly take up all the screen, and there's even an option to make the fonts bigger to help you out with reading some of the very small writing. But beyond that slight limitation, it shouldn't really be too much of an issue to run this game. Once we actually get into the game, we've got to make our party. So we play up to 4 characters in this particular game, and we do get to customize them. Now, obviously, visuals are a little lacking here, so you're mostly just picking a little bit of art in that particular sense, and the sprite as a result of that, which doesn't change via equipment or anything, but we do get to pick a class here at the start, which is in fact just a starting point, and will give you some bonuses to a few attributes and skills that will obviously point you in the direction of the characters you want to make. Now, what little I do know about this game ahead of time is that apparently archers or anything using ranged attacks isn't fantastic, and to generally avoid them, and I'll be curious to find out why that sentiment seems to exist. But otherwise, you've got a few classes that represent some sort of magic user, fighters, dexterity-focused characters, that type of thing. In addition to that stuff, there's also a whole host of traits that will help you customize what all of these characters can do as they start leveling up, which can do things like increase their health, help them dual wield if you want them to, which they can do, by the way, increase their magical effectiveness, the usual stuff. But what's perhaps more interesting is all of the abilities. So there are mage spells, priest spells, battle disciplines, and then a whole host of just sort of general skills you can learn. Now, magic and combat skills are pretty straightforward. They basically just increase your effectiveness with that type of thing. But there are other skills like cave lore that allow you to find caches out on the world map, so you can dig those up and find loot. And then there's stuff like tool use, which of course helps you pick locks and find hidden passages, that kind of thing. And most of that stuff is accounted for on a party-wide level, which was pretty neat to me. And when you start throwing all of those things together in an actual party, it really does feel like you've got each character sort of progressing along a set path with their own equipment, because things like, for instance, heavier armor reduces your chance to hit, and the idea there is that you're going to offset that by getting fighter skills which increase your chance to hit, say by increasing your strength, or just taking points in melee weapons as an example will increase your chance to hit with those, offsetting the negatives you get from wearing heavy armor. And that's kind of how they keep the caster classes from using it, in addition to the fact that after a certain point you just can't cast. But one of the more interesting things to me about this game so far has really been the world, though, because down here in the pit, obviously things are not exactly cozy by any means, but they're more livable than you might initially think, though pretty much every city seems to have problems with a few issues, such as various monsters, the typically very aggressive Nephilim, which are like a cat race, and the sort of lizardmen whose name I cannot pronounce. And much of the early settlements see you going around just dealing with local problems. But what I noticed is that I've only so far in like roughly 8 or 9 hours, having explored the first corner of a sort of giant cavernous system that you're in and will be exploring. So I get the impression that this game's world is larger than I would have initially thought, and it'll be curious to me to see how that winds up panning out with the game's story, because like the main goal is just to escape this place from what I understand, and with the game's typical multiple endings alongside you just sort of free roaming this area that you've been dumped into, can sort of spin all that stuff together. It's the little details like how the Empire is for some reason sending supplies down to these people it's banished. There's a sort of Imperial agent that I've discovered who seems to be involved in some sort of plot down here, and I'm looking forward to seeing where those narrative threads lead, because the situation is inherently pretty interesting. Let's talk a little bit about combat, because it's not an insignificant part of this game. I haven't seen anything approaching a stealth option, so combat is definitely something you're going to be doing quite a bit of, and having played some of Spiderweb Software's other games, I kind of get the gist of it. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the sort of engine, so to speak, that they've been using for their Geneforge remakes as an example. But combat basically sees each of your 4 characters being given a set amount of action points based on their stats and skills and everything. While you can use that action point to move or use items out of your inventory, once you either use all of your action points or you attack, your turn is pretty much over, barring a few exceptions that let you take an action twice. And I've noticed for certain characters, using things like a wand from their inventory followed up by an actual spell will usually work out, because things like wands from your inventory don't necessarily end your turn unless they happen to take all of your action points, which is not usually the case if you don't have to move. So in that way, you can sort of guarantee that you have 2 attacks to make in pretty much every scenario. But as mentioned, we've, in addition to items and things, got our abilities in the form of mage spells, pre-spells, and battle disciplines. Mage spells and pre-spells are basically what you would expect. They're governed by different stats, of course, or skills, if you will, and you'll learn more from either finding them just out in the world via little pedestals, or learning magic from various teachers you can find in various places. This is going to give you spells to cast on the enemy, and while it was a little slow going at first, once I've got some spells under my belt, I've been doing much, much better. But those spells, of course, cost energy or mana, and the priest side of things tends to lean a little more on healing and like buffs, but you do have some variety in there for each. You can then upgrade these as well to make them more effective. I think the maximum is 3, so that's something to know. But what's really been interesting to me has actually been the battle disciplines. Basically, as you learn more and more melee skills, rather than having to go to trainers or anything, your character just picks up on these disciplines naturally, and these will give you things like the ability to knock enemies down, immobilize them, knock them back, attack multiple enemies around you. But using these activates fatigue. Fatigue is effectively like a cooldown that character initiates based on the move they just did, and of course some stats they can use to reduce these things. And I'm looking forward to seeing how some of that evolves over the course of the game, because just right away at the start here, the game has been surprisingly difficult until I got some experience, that is to say literal experience, to level up with, and of course access to a few spells. And so far I'm just playing on normal, so I'm curious how that sort of curve goes for the rest of the game, because when my second playthrough rolls around on Torment difficulty, which is the highest one, I'm guessing just straight away there's going to be like a very particular order, more or less, that you need to accomplish things in to get that experience before you really start trying to take on too many fights. But first impressions wise, so this doesn't drag on forever, so far I'm enjoying it quite a bit, more so than I was expecting. The game seems to be bigger than I was expecting, to be honest, so I'm not really sure how long this is going to take to fully review, though I'm not too concerned about it. Mostly I'm just looking forward to seeing how all these systems evolve and change over the course of this one. They've set up a lot of really cool stuff here at the beginning, And I'm curious to see if it can actually execute on all those ideas to a good enough degree, so to speak. For now, I think that's where we'll leave it. So if you're looking forward to learning more about this sort of cult classic CRPG, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, stick around for a little while, as the review will be coming up before too long. Regardless of any of that though, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing